we really want all of you to join us in the World Congress of Pediatric Cardiology and Cardiac Surgery. It's going to be in the end of August, beginning of September this year in Washington, D.C. If you scan this QR code, you're going to go to the website of the Congress. The registrations and the hotel reservations are already open, so please join and send your abstracts. Talk to your team. I hope to meet all of you there. I'm going to be very happy to meet in person all of you guys. And now with you, this amazing session of Dr. Anderson. Oh, this is my fault, guys. I cannot, I'm using two screens. I'm getting confused. Sorry. Okay. Just a second. Sorry for that, guys.
Well, good afternoon to you all, ladies and gentlemen. So today we continue our journey through cardiac development. And as you will see, we're going to be discussing the development of the ventricular mass. I'm going to follow the same approach that we've done over the past 2 episodes in our journey, which were basic development and then development of the atrial chambers. So if we are to understand ventricular development, we need to know the building blocks, as we did the atrial chambers. And of course, since we are discussing development, we need to know from where they come. And again, we need to know which of the various features we're going to be discussing is of most importance to you when you distinguish between the ventricles in the setting of the congenitally malformed heart. So I'm going to follow the same approach. It's a jigsaw. First of all, we identify the pieces, and then, most importantly, we need to know what they look like when they are all put together. So you'll remember I showed you this from the previous episode when we discussed atrial development. We find, first of all, the pieces, we put them together, and it can be complicated. So I shared with you this huge jigsaw by L.S. Lowry, Going to Work. And atrial development was quite complicated. So the end picture there was not easy to put together. I hope that today, when we discuss the ventricles, things will be a little bit easier because there are not quite so many pieces. So when we look at the ventricles, we have 3 parts. I hope you're all aware of this by now. So components of the ventricular chambers are the inlet, the apocomponent, and the outlet. So let's look first of all at what we're trying to produce. So you'll recognize, I hope, that here we are seeing the finished version of the right ventricle. We're looking at it from the front. I've removed the parietal parts of the ventricular wall so you can see the septal surface. When we consider development of the ventricles, we have to consider their boundaries. So they extend from the atrioventricular junction, and I hope you can see that is a clear anatomic boundary. You can see very nicely there the fibroadipose tissue of the atrioventricular junction that interposes between the atrial myocardium and the ventricular myocardium. It's a little more complicated when we get to the ventricular junction with the arterial trunks. because in fact that is the sinutubular junction, which is distal to the end of the ventricular mass. Now, we're not going to have time to discuss that today, but we'll get into that a little bit more in our final session of development when we discuss what happens in the outflow tract. Today, all we need to know is that as we analyze the ventricles, we can recognize their inlet extending from the atrioventricular junction to the margins of the attachments of the tension apparatus of the atrioventricular valve. The apical component, you see, I've also called it the apical trabecular component, because this is the component that is dominated by those trabeculations. And in the right ventricle, those trabeculations are coarse. And then we have the outlet. I hope you all know by now, right ventricle, the outlet is a complete muscular sleeve, and that extends up to support the leaflets of the pulmonary valve. When we look at the left ventricle, it's the same heart. I've simply switched it round, dissected some of the parietal walls so that you can look at the septal surface of the left ventricle. Again, it extends from the anatomically discrete atrioventricular junction, and the boundary of the ventricular cavity is the sinutubular junction. It has an inlet, again, a well-formed apical trabecular component. This time, the trabeculations of the morphologically left ventricle are fine and crisscrossing. Then, when we get to the outlet, things are not quite as clear-cut as they were in the right ventricle, because the feature, the left ventricle, is the fact that its leaflets of its inlet valve, mitral valve, are in fibrous continuity with the leaflets of the aortic valve. Now, again, time will not permit me to go into the details of how we get this fibrous continuity. And in a way, that's one of the unanswered questions of cardiac development. And I'll finish up on that theme. Now, which of these is most important to you when you come to analyze the ventricles? Without question, it is the apical component that is most constant. So following the morphological method on the basis that we don't identify structures using other features that are themselves variable, it is the nature of those apical trabeculations that we use to distinguish between what is morphologically right and what is morphologically left. And as you will see, those components, developing ventricles, are discrete from the outlet. Now, before we move on to consider the details of development, Norman has asked me to share with you again where you can get the details of the material I'm going to use to demonstrate development. So I recommend again to you this work that, as you see, was produced in Communications in Biology. It's an open access manuscript. You can gain access through this to all the interactive PDF files that were produced by Jill Hixbos, Wouter Lammers, working at the University of Maastricht. You'll see that I was part of their group when we published this work, and I'm going to be using these interactive PD files very much during today's presentation. So this is where you can find them. That is the details that you need, and you can manipulate the PD files because they are all available through this work. And then I'm also going to be showing you some histologic slides that come from this database. You see that it's housed at the University of Newcastle. I still work in Newcastle with Deborah Henderson and Bill Chowdhury. And this is the database that Deborah now has responsibility for. It's the Human Developmental Biology Resource. It is an amazing website. And very shortly, it's going to be improved because the material it contains will be available to you through the net. But already you can find three-dimensional models, you can find histology sections, you can find reconstructions, and you can find descriptions of where the different genes are. So if you want to follow up on what I'm telling you, I recommend also that you gain access to this database. But let's get down to the nitty-gritty, and let's come back to those trabecular components, because it is the formation of the apical components of the two ventricles from the primary heart tube that gives us the starting point for ongoing development. And the key process is what we call ballooning. Now, you've seen this before. This is our starting point. This is the stage at which we can see the ventricular loop. It's beyond the straight heart tube stage. It's what we call Carnegie stage 11, CS, you will remember, stands Carnegie stage. And this is at the beginning of the 5th week of human development. 28 days have passed since the conception of the embryo. And this is one of those interactive PD files. And I've taken from the PD files the sinus horns, where the venous tributaries are coming together at this stage. They are bilaterally symmetrical. And you'll remember from the previous description where we discussed atrial development, this is the stage at which we can begin to see the formation of the atrial component of the developing heart. And the atrial component, through the atrioventricular canal, leads us on to the ventricular loop. But at this early stage, the ventricular loop is no more than a solitary tube. It is part of the primary heart tube. And at its other end, it gives rise to the outflow tract. So to begin ventricular development, we need to look again at ballooning. This is one of the drawings made by my colleagues in Amsterdam. It was Antoon Moerman and his colleagues who made this excellent cartoon, which shows you how the atrial appendages balloon from the atrial component of the primary heart tube. And we discussed last week how these balloon in parallel. Now, the key to development of ventricles is that the apical components of the ventricles balloon in series. And so from the inlet of the ventricular loop, we have the ballooning of the left ventricle. From the outlet of the ventricular loop, we have ballooning of the right ventricle. And as these apical components balloon outwards from the outer curvature, so we get formation of the apical ventricular septum between them. So as we get formation of the apical components, so too do we get formation of the apical ventricular septum. Now, this is what it looks like in a drawing. This is what it looks like in an interactive PD file, one of those created by Wout and Jill. And what I've done here is I have taken the reconstruction of the cavities from their interactive file. And you see we're now at Carnegie stage 13. We're towards the end of the 5th week of development. Around 32 days have now passed. So this is 4 or 5 days after the previous stage I showed you, when we simply had a straight heart tube. And now again, you can see the atrioventricular canal. It's opening into the inlet part of the ventricular loop, but something has happened to that inlet part of the ventricular loop, because you can also now see the trabeculations. And those are the trabeculations of the developing left ventricle. And they are ahead of the trabeculations that will form eventually right ventricle, and arising from the outlet part of the ventricular loop, where we are getting formation, right ventricle, we have the outflow tract. So this is what it looks like in one of Jill and Wout's interactive PDF files. This is what it looks like when we take an episcopic data set. It's one of the multiple data sets made by my good friend and colleague, Tim Mohan, like myself, now retired. He made these whilst he was working at, first of all, the National Institute for Medical Research in the United Kingdom, which transferred into the Crick Institute. And here we've gone another 2 stages, but we're still at the stage where another 2 days, but we're still at the stage of ballooning. So there now you're looking at the undersurface of the atrioventricular canal. And what I hope you can see is that the atrioventricular canal at this stage is supported exclusively by the cavity of what will become the left ventricle. And that is ballooning from the inlet part of the primary heart tube. Now there has been much better formation of the apical component of what will be the right ventricle. It is supporting the entirety of the outflow tract. So now between the two, we are getting formation of the muscular ventricular septum. And this now permits me to show you what is going to be the focus of our attention throughout the remainder of our session today. And that is the channel through which all the blood entering the left ventricle has to pass so as to reach the right ventricle. It is the interventricular communication. But what I'm going to stress for you, the changes that take place in the boundaries of this interventricular communication, or rather, the relationship between these boundaries and morphologically right, the morphologically left ventricle. And for that purpose, at this stage, I am identifying this interventricular communication as the primary communication. Its boundaries, of course, will stay the same. But as you will see, their relationships change remarkably. And it is the remodeling this communication that is going to be our focus. So let me summarize for you the situation at the moment. We are coming towards the end of the 5th week of development. And at this stage, because the AV canal opens only to the left ventricle, the outlet arises only from the right ventricle, essentially, we've got double inlet or common inlet, left ventricle, double outlet, common outlet from the right ventricle. So I hope that it is obvious to you that if we are going to produce the definitive situation, we've got to give the right ventricle inlet component, and the left ventricle is going to derive an outlet component. And that is why during these processes, there is going to be remodeling of that primary interventricular foramen. So how does that take place? Well, let's do this in temporal sequence. Because the first thing that happens is that the right ventricle obtains its inlet part. And it does this simply by expanding the atrioventricular canal. And here we see the first step in remodeling of that primary interventricular communication. Because the remodeling gives the right ventricle its inlet and at the same time produces the orifice of what will become the tricuspid valve. So let's go back to sections. So another section from an episcopic data set, a human episcopic data set prepared by Dr. Mohan. So the human data set, as you see, we're nearly now at the end of the 5th week of development. I'm showing you this time a 4-chamber section, because I want to emphasize again that at this early stage, the entirety of the circumference of the atrioventricular canal is looking into the developing left ventricle. So all of the blood at this stage entering, developing ventricle has to pass through that primary interventricular foramen if it is to reach the developing right ventricle. So here we go. We've got one stage further, Carnegie stage 15. We're now at the beginning of the 6th week of development, around 36 days. Again, a 4-chamber section. And you can see, I hope, what has happened. There has been expansion rightwards of the atrioventricular canal. And that simple process of rightward expansion has permitted the cavity, developing right atrium, to look directly into the cavity of what will now become the definitive right ventricle. The right ventricle has acquired its inlet. And in so doing, the primary interventricular communication has become remodeled. Because now the interventricular communication is providing the outlet for the developing left ventricle, whereas the right ventricle has acquired its own inlet. So now I can call this the secondary interventricular frame, because by that remodeling, part of the initial boundaries surround the developing tricuspid valve. And we know that that is the case. We know that there has been remodeling of this primary interventricular communication, because quite some time ago now, working with my colleagues in Amsterdam, Wout Lammers was still at the University of Amsterdam at that stage. And this is from the manuscript we published in early in the 1990s with Wout as the first author. And we were able to chart the remodeling of the primary interventricular foramen by making these histologic sections in which we used the antibody to the nodose ganglion of the chick to demonstrate the presence of the myocardium surrounding the primary interventricular foramen. There you see it. It's stained brown, and we call this the primary ring. And it surrounds the primary interventricular foramen. And we can now look at this in the interactive PD files, again prepared by Jill and Wout. Wout now, as you know, is working at the University of Maastricht. So I'm showing you here an earlier stage. This is at the stage where we have double inlet, developing left ventricle, double outlet from the developing right ventricle. So there you're looking at the cavity, right atrium. Here is the cavity of the developing right ventricle. And at this stage, the right ventricle is supporting the entirety of the outflow tract. Now, the beauty of these interactive PDF files is that you can take away the parts that are obscuring your particular view. So in this interactive PD file, I can take away the apical trabecular part of the right ventricle and the outflow tract. And now you are looking directly into the primary interventricular foramen. At the back, you see the trabeculations of the developing left ventricle, and Wout and Jill have marked the location of that primary ring, which they had demonstrated previously using the antibody to the nodose ganglion chick. And this shows you, I hope, very nicely how the primary ring is surrounding the primary interventricular foramen. We can take the same data set and we can rotate it, and we can take away the cavities of the atrial chambers. And now we can look down on the atrioventricular canal from above. And the atrioventricular canal is the yellow tissue that you see. It's surrounding the opening of the canal, which is supported exclusively by the developing left ventricle. You see at the back, Jill and Wout have also marked the vestibular spine. I'm going to show you the importance of that as it separates the atrioventricular canal into the right and left atrioventricular orifices. But now you can also see the location of the primary ring, and at this stage, you will see that it is confluent with the rightward margin of the atrioventricular canal. It's surrounding the primary interventricular foramen. So how do we know that there is remodeling of this primary ring? We know that because we can chart what happens to the ring that has been demonstrated by the nodose ganglion of the chick. So this is another human embryo that we stained using the nodose ganglion of the chick, but this time we're at Carnegie stage 16. 2 days have passed, about 4 now we're 38 days. But what I hope you can see is that there is the basal part of the ring that is still on the crest of the muscular ventricular septum, but the top part of the ring has expanded rightwards. And there is the remainder of the ring. And now by charting the full contour of this ring that was initially a circle surrounding the interventricular communication, we can work out the remodeling that's taken place as the right ventricle has acquired its inlet. Because now part of the boundary of the ring surrounds the developing orifice of the tricuspid valve. The remainder of the communication is now the outflow tract for the left ventricle. And so I can now call that the secondary interventricular foramen. The dorsal part is surrounding the tricuspid valvar orifice. So expansion of the atrioventricular canal has given the right ventricle its inlet, but during this process, the cushions within the canal have also fused to separate the right and left orifices. And this is where the vestibular spine comes into its own, because it grows in, muscularizes, and it forms the true secondary atrial septum, binding down the primary septum to the atrial aspect of the fused cushions. And so we can see this in another of the interactive PD files prepared by Jill and Wout. It's the same stage as I showed you with that histologic section in which, a long time ago now, we demonstrated what had happened to the ring that was shown to us by staining with the nodose ganglion. So here we are, Carnegie stage 16, 38 days of development. We're almost at the end of the 5th week of development. Again, yellow is the atrioventricular canal myocardium, but now the atrioventricular canal has expanded and it's opening directly into the right ventricle. Within the canal, we can see the two cushions, but we can also see the growth of the primary atrial septum. And as the primary atrial septum grows towards the cushions, carrying with it its mesenchymal cap, it is reducing the size of the primary foramen. Now there at the back, we have the vestibular spine, and that is going to grow in and reinforce the closure primary foramen, as we discussed in our previous account of atrial development. So now when we turn the data set so that we can look down on the atrioventricular canal, here now at a later stage, another two stages have taken place. We're now at the beginning of the 7th week of development, 43 days since conception. We can now see very nicely how the atrioventricular canal is opening into the right ventricle. So the atrioventricular cushions are fused, and now the vestibular spine has grown in to reinforce the attachment of the primary septum to that atrial surface, giving us the second atrial septum. We have separate atrioventricular orifices. But in the same data set, Jill and Wout have marked what has happened to that primary ring. And the primary ring is now shown to us in the browny red color. And it is showing us how its dorsal part, the part on the crest of the ventricular septum, is forming what will be the atrioventricular bundle. But the expansion of the atrioventricular canal means that what initially was part of that primary foramen has now expanded to surround the developing tricuspid valvar orifice. We can take away the atrial chambers, the atrioventricular canal, and now you can see the remodeling that's taken place relative to the primary interventricular foramen. There is the vestibular spine, that is the buttress of the atrial septum, and you can see that the dorsal part of that initial ring is now surrounding the orifice of the tricuspid valve. It is marking the ventricular inlet. The remainder of the ring is surrounding the persisting part of that primary foramen which is now giving us the outlet for the developing left ventricle. Because at this stage, the left ventricle still does not have its own inlet. Both of the inlet components remain supported by the developing right ventricle. So now we have to consider, how does the left ventricle obtain its outlet? We've seen that it was expansion of the atrioventricular canal that gave the right ventricle its inlet. I hope you now appreciate that what was initially the primary foramen is now the secondary foramen, and it is providing the left ventricle with its outlet. And that is because the aortic root at this stage is still supported above the developing right ventricle. So let's look at that. And I can show you what happens in the developing outlet components much better by using mouse hearts. So this is another episcopic data set from a mouse heart prepared again by Dr. Mohan. And this is during the 13th day of development, embryonic day 12.5. You can now see how the right ventricle has acquired its own inlet. So the communication between the chambers is now the secondary interventricular foramen. But this data set shows you very nicely how both the pulmonary root and the aortic root are supported by the developing right ventricle. But we can see two other very important structures now. And these are the proximal parts of the cushions that are going to divide the outflow tract so as to produce the right ventricle and the subaortic outlet, the subaortic root. But at this stage, they're both supported above the right ventricle. And it is the formation, the fusion of these outlet cushions that will put the aortic root into communication with the left ventricle. So how does that happen? Well, let's look in a little more detail at these outflow cushions. So this is the same data set. I've rotated it so I can cut through the two cushions, and you can see that they have fused together distally. The most distal part of the outflow tract is already separated to become the intrapericardial aorta, the intrapericardial pulmonary trunk. We'll go through this again in our final session on development at the end of April, when we are going to discuss the overall development of the outflow tract. At this stage, the distal parts of the cushions have fused together. And one of the cushions is attached to the septum, the other is attached to the parietal wall of the right ventricle. And as they complete their fusion, they are going to build a shelf in the roof of the developing right ventricle. They're going to build a partition, and that partition is going to put the aortic root into communication through the secondary interventricular foramen with the cavity of the left ventricle. So let's look at this process in some detail. Let me remind you what has happened already. The distal outflow cushions are fused as separating the arterial roots, but as yet, those proximal cushions have not fully fused. They are going to fuse, and they are going to create a tunnel. So here is our starting point, and this is a beautiful reconstruction looking into the roof of the ventricle at this stage. It's been made by my friend and colleague, Simon Bamforth, who also works in the University of Newcastle. So Simon has reconstructed from a data set the pulmonary root, the aortic root, and in brown, you can see those cushions. One is parietally located, the other is septally located, and at this stage, they have only fused distally. But as they complete their fusion, they are going to build a tunnel. And then now you see the shell of that tunnel within the cavity of the developing right ventricle. Where later on, embryonic day 12.5, see the pulmonary root, the aortic root, still supported above the cavity of the right ventricle, but now the cushions have fused and they have built this partition in the roof of the right ventricle. So we can take the data set and we can rotate it, we can look at it in 4-chamber fashion, and I can show you that shelf that has now been built in the roof of the right ventricle, creating a tunnel. So to your left hand, you can see the cavity of the right ventricle, and there in its roof, we see the parietal cushion, septal cushion, and they have fused together. And by fusing together, they have created the tunnel. At one end of the tunnel, we have the aortic root. Through the secondary interventricular communication, at the other end, we have the left ventricle. Now, Simon's also made a very nice reconstruction of this same data set. Here it is. It's exactly the same data set. There you see partition that has been built by fusion of the cushions. And what I hope you can see now is that beneath the aortic root, there is cavity of the right ventricle. But by building the shelf and through this tunnel, the cavity of the right ventricle is put into continuity with the left ventricle. And eventually, that cavity, which initially belonged to the right ventricle, will become part of the left ventricle. And that is because at this stage, not only is there the secondary interventricular communication, this is the same data set again, I cut it a little more dorsally, so you can see the aortic root. And there you see the secondary interventricular communication, which is going to become the outflow tract of the left ventricle. But you can also see that at this stage, there is still a communication between the aortic root and the right ventricle. And there has to be this communication at this stage, and that's because the cavity beneath the aortic root initially belonged to the right ventricle. So to give the aortic root finally to the left ventricle, we have to close that aorto-right ventricular communication. And once closed, the aortic root will become part of the left ventricle. And if we look at the same data set from beneath, now you're sitting underneath the heart now, you're looking from the diaphragmatic aspect cranially, so that beneath is the left ventricle. We've cut across the ventricular septum, there is the subpulmonary outflow tract, and in the roof of the right ventricle, you're looking at that tunnel, the wall of that tunnel that has been built in the cavity of the ventricle so as to connect the aortic root through the secondary interventricular communication with the left ventricle. And there you see that aorto-right ventricular communication. But once it's closed, it will complete ventricular septation. So we can also call this the tertiary interventricular communication. And it is closed by these tubercles of the atrioventricular cushions. And if I revert back to a human embryo at a comparable stage of development, as you see, 49 days, we're at the end of the 7th week of development. This is Carnegie stage 20. You can see what has happened when those tubercles have come together and have fused to close that aorto-right ventricular communication, which we can also call the tertiary interventricular communication. It's a short axis section, so you can see the developing mitral valve, developing ventricular septum, and to the top, we see the pulmonary root. These are the outflow cushions that are now muscularizing, because that muscularized shell will become freestanding subpulmonary infundibulum. And there is the subaortic outflow tract. Initially, it was part of the right ventricle, but now it has become the outflow tract, the left ventricle, connected to the cavity of the left ventricle through the secondary interventricular communication. And there are those tubercles that fuse together, and as you will see, they will eventually become the membranous part of the ventricular septum. And this is what it looks like in the interactive PD file, exactly the same stage, Carnegie stage 20, the end of the 7th week of development. There are those fused proximal cushions. They are in exactly the same place as you saw them in the mouse heart. When they muscularize, they will become the freestanding infundibulate sleeve. But there is another important point to take into account. So here we are in the middle of that 8th week of development, Carnegie stage 22. Embryonic development stops at the end of 8 weeks, and we move into the fetal stage. Now, this is again a frontal section. So there you see the aortic root, and we know by now that the aortic root is connected through that tunnel that was initially part of the right ventricle. Now its cavity belongs to the left ventricle. But, key point, although the aortic root is now connected to the left ventricle, it is aligned with the right ventricle. And I can show you that equally well when we take the interactive PDF file that Jill and Wout have prepared for the final stage of embryonic development. At the end of, after 56 days have taken place, 8 weeks of development, Carnegie stage 23. You're looking at it from the front, and you see that the aortic root is connected now to the left ventricle, but is still positioned above the cavity of the right ventricle. But the aorto-right ventricular communication has now been closed by those tubercles, which themselves are now remodeling to become the membranous part of the septum. So now secondary communication has become the left ventricular outflow tract. But this is not the final situation. This is the point I made earlier. At this stage, the aortic root has not yet wedged itself between the mitral valve and the septum. And indeed, at this stage, it still has a completely muscular infundibulum. So there are still changes to take place before we get the definitive outflow tracts, just as there are changes to take place at the atrioventricular junction, because both of the junctions are going to expand before we have the definitive situation that we see in the forward heart. But there is one important thing that I would like to emphasize to you that is relevant to our consideration of congenital cardiac malformations. And we're going to move on to that, having finished our accounts of development. What I've shown you is that during transfer of the aortic root to the left ventricle, the embryo built that shelf using the proximal outflow cushions. And in so doing, the secondary communication became the left ventricular outflow tract. That is exactly what the surgeon does when repairing double outlet right ventricle. So let me show you again what has happened in the embryo. You've seen this before. Developing right ventricle, developing aortic root. There is the secondary interventricular communication. And those cushions are building a shelf so as to commit the aortic root to the left ventricle. And that is exactly what the surgeon does when repairing a heart such as this, where we have the aortic root positioned above the cavity of the right ventricle. The secondary interventricular communication is the channel between the ventricles. The area closed so as to permit the aortic root to the left ventricle is the aorto-right ventricular communication. And as you will recall, I renamed that the tertiary interventricular communication. So that is very important, because when the surgeon repairs double outlet right ventricle, he never closes the channel that you might call the ventricular septal defect. The area surgeon closes is the aorto-right ventricular communication. And that is exactly the same area that is closed when the surgeon repairs tetralogy of Fallot. So here's a picture of tetralogy of Fallot. You can see the aortic root overriding the crest of the ventricular septum. and there is the left ventricle, and there is the right ventricle. So again, we have the aorto-left ventricular communication, that is the secondary interventricular communication. We have the aorto-right ventricular communication. And in Morphology of Fellow, that is the area you call the ventricular septal defect. And always it is the aorto-right ventricular communication has to be closed so as to put the aortic root into communication with the left ventricle. And indeed, it is failure during development to close that aorto-right ventricular communication that gives us the perimembranous ventricular septal defect. And if you look at a picture we've drawn of a perimembranous ventricular septal defect, I hope you can immediately recognize the similarity between this arrangement in the congenitally malformed heart and what we were looking at during development in the murine heart. Because there is the aorto-right ventricular communication, but now we call it a perimembranous defect. Its phenotypic feature is the continuity posterior-inferiorly between the leaflets of the tricuspid and the mitral valves, and that is the remnant of those tubercles, the atrioventricular cushions that should have closed this channel. And always, when we have tricuspid to mitral continuity, the phenotypic feature, the perimembranous defect, we know the conduction axis will be posterior-inferiorly located because that is the primary ring that we initially found on the crest of the muscular ventricular septum. So, what I hope I've shown you during today's presentation is how our understanding of ventricular development depends on understanding remodeling of the primary interventricular communication. I hope I've shown you how subsequent to the initial stage of development, that primary foramen has become the secondary foramen, that is the exit, the left ventricle. And then the final step in remodeling is to close the tertiary communication, which is the aorto-right ventricular foramen, which remains after the embryo has built that shelf in the roof of the right ventricle. And hopefully, I've now shown you that the knowledge of ventricular development permits us to make realistic interpretations regarding those channels that remain between the ventricles in the setting of congenital heart disease. So next week, we're going to discuss development of the outflow tract, and then we'll take forward this notion of cardiac development relative to the channels that exist between the ventricles when there is deficient ventricular septation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson. Amazing session as usual. And guys, please type all of your questions on a Q&A chat box. And now we are going to start with our dear Norman Silverman commenting this session.
Well, thank you very much, Bob, for that absolutely magnificent lecture and the full description of the primary interventricular ring and the formation of the tunnel between the right ventricle into the coming through the secondary interventricular foramen and into the left ventricular outflow tract. Now, there's one important question I have to ask, and that's in the previous description of the formation of the membranous septum, a portion of the proximal outflow cushions was also included in the membranous septum. Is that correct?
No, the membranous septum, if you go all the way back to the description given by Odgers suggested that the outflow cushions also contributed to the membranous septum. In fact, we know now that that is not the case. We know that, as I showed you, the outflow cushions, in fact, muscularize. And so the outflow cushions, that shelf that becomes the freestanding infundibular sleeve. The distal cushions also muscularize. They provide the support the developing leaflets of the arterial roots. So that it is incorrect to suggest that the outflow cushions also contribute to the membranous septum. The membranous septum is only the tubercles of the superior and inferior atrioventricular cushions.
Okay, that's great. That explains that. The other thing that I'd like to ask you is from previous descriptions of the embryology is that there's a spiraling that occurs in the outlet cushions. And I see you smiling. So what have you got to say about that?
Again, there's when the cushions first form, and we'll discuss this in our next session at the end of April, they are derived from the jelly that lines the inner curvature, the inner layer of the heart tube. And the heart tube has a bend in it. So there is a degree of spiraling as the jelly remodels to become the cushions, but then the outflow tract straightens. So when the two cushions then fuse, there is no longer any spiraling. And Wout Lammers takes the point that the spiral, in fact, is transferred to the most distal part of the outflow tract, which has become non-myocardial, and that is separated by the aortopulmonary septum. So the apparent spiraling that was seen initially is then seen between the aortopulmonary septum, which is at a considerable angle relative to what derives from the cushions. And the cushions primarily muscularize. The distal cushions support the leaflets of the arterial valves. Then, as I've shown you, the proximal cushions build that partition in the roof of the right ventricle, and they become the freestanding infundibular sleeve. So the old notion that there was spiraling of the cushions is not strictly correct. There is a spiraling of the outflow tract itself, and that is fundamentally different in transposition. We know that in the setting of transposition, there is never that twist in the outflow tract at the very early stage. So the outflow tract in transposition is straight from the outset. So the spiraling versus the straightness is correct in that respect. But before the cushions eventually fuse, even in the normal situation, the outflow tract has straightened itself out, if that makes any sense to you.
Well, it certainly is heady information and helps to clear up some of the mythology that has gone into previous embryology, the armchair philosophy of what happens related to one's concept of how it happens. So the other interesting issue that I think for me, and I think for many of the audience today, concerns with this part of the left ventricular outflow tract or the aortic root that comes to lie in the left ventricle through the secondary interventricular foramen in a process. And unfortunately, you don't have any intermediate pictures. We see always the tunnel from the left ventricle, and then we see it as part of the left ventricular outflow tract. And one assumes that in the development of this tunnel, it passes through the secondary interventricular foramen, and then finally fuses with the mitral valve, creating mitral aortic fibrous continuity. So what this brings up to my mind is it brings up the issue of what really is double outlet right ventricle, and is this a spectrum of diseases related to this absorption of the left ventricular outflow tract?
Well, in fact, it's it's the interesting point you raise as to how we get the aortic to mitral fibrous continuity. It's the inner heart curve, in fact. It's the back wall of the tunnel. It's not the shelf itself that changes. The shelf is a right ventricular structure, and the shelf remains a right ventricular structure, and that becomes the freestanding subpulmonary infundibulum. And then once that has closed the interventricular communication, then the middle part of that cushion mass becomes extracavitary tissue. It contains neural crest cells, and that tissue then becomes ceases to be a space between the cavities, it becomes extracavitary tissue, and that separates the muscularized shell of the cushions from the aortic root, which is formed at the back of it. So then the back part of the tunnel, the top of the tunnel, if you like, is the initial inner heart curvature. And that is the part that started off being myocardial. And it is that part that then is remodeled to become fibrous tissue. And you are right. That is the mechanism that at the moment we don't know a great deal about. It happens in fetal life. So it happens between 8 weeks and 10 or 12 weeks of development in the human heart. In the mouse heart, it takes place during embryonic days 15 and 16. So again, subsequent to closure of the embryonic interventricular communication. But the key point, when the aortic root has become connected to the left ventricle, there is a complete muscular subaortic infundibulum. And you will know that very rarely we can, in fact, find normal hearts that have retention of that muscular subpulmonary infundibulum. And the real question you're asking takes us back to that old canard, if you like, when it was suggested you had to have a complete muscular infundibulum to have double outlet right ventricle. But Diane, who did the larger part of a study that we published together with one of the fellows from Gainesville, from the University of Florida, and I think, Diane, we collected what, altogether over 100 hearts, didn't we? Diane?
I think close to that, yeah.
And I think of those 100 hearts, 40%, did they not have aortic to mitral fibrous continuity in the presence of double outlet right ventricle?
Right.
Yeah.
And we now know, Norman, that Andrew Cook was telling me, I was with Andrew Cook last week, and Andrew Cook he has now gone to the Great Ormond Street archive, and he's collected together 300 examples of tetralogy. And in his 300 examples of tetralogy, he's found 10 or 20 that have a complete muscular infundibulum. Adrian has what? Adrian, you have what? 200 examples of tetralogy?
Yes, indeed. And we are going to review that together with Andrew to add to the overall number.
So we can come back, Norman, that in fact the bilateral infundibulum is another of those variable entities. Yeah. And it can exist even in the normal heart, it can exist in tetralogy, and it has nothing to do with the diagnosis of double outlet right ventricle.
And I have a couple cases that have transposition.
Absolutely. It's another of those variables.
So I want to make one last point, Bob, which I think supports your ideas, is if you look at the subcostal echocardiogram and a perimembranous ventricular septal defect, it actually appears that the aorta is overriding the ventricular septum.
Absolutely.
And you have seen that, and so have all the other echocardiographers in this group. And I think that when you look at that in relationship to today's discussion, this becomes very clear that this is what we are looking at.
And indeed, I mean, the very point you make, as I've been putting of all this together, and as we've been doing this now, and you know full well, we've been doing this now for at least 18 months. And as I look at these things, and as you all ask me these questions, it's become evident to me, as I said today, that what we call the ventricular septal defect is in fact an aorto-right ventricular communication.
Right.
The point you've just made. And when we start thinking of it as an aorto-right ventricular communication, it gives something that we can hang our hat on. Because in tetralogy of Fallot, the ventricular septal defect is an aorto-right ventricular communication. And that then brings us to the paradox that when we get to double outlet right ventricle, almost everybody calls the aorta left ventricular communication, the ventricular septal defect. But when the surgeon goes in, the surgeon still closes the aorta right ventricular communication.
That's correct.
So the point you make there, as you say, when you are diagnosing and when you're looking at this ventricular septal defect, it's the aorta right ventricular communication.
Yes, the thing that is still hard for me to understand, and I'll have to rethink this as I look at perimembranous ventricular septal defects is it seems easy to assume that some of the communication is between the outlet tissue, the outlet cushions, and the ventricular septal defect, but you say that it's really just the tubercles of the AV canal that close the defect.
Well, that of course is because it's the fact that the hole has not been closed. Now you raise another interesting point there, because in fact, the tubercles oftentimes are retained and they are producing what the Japanese call the membranous flap. So you are correct when you bring the emphasis back onto those outflow cushions, because the reason that you get the defect is because the outflow cushions have not closed sufficient, they've not built a big enough shelf that the tubercles of the atrioventricular canal are then able to close the persisting aorto-right ventricular communication.
Sure,
So when that's why oftentimes you see the perimembranous defect, usually in fact opening to the outlet of the right ventricle.
That's correct. And what I think is so important is when we look at specimens, when you see this membranous flap, the membranous flap is in that posterior inferior area where you would expect the fusion of the tubercles to have occurred.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, I think I've learned a lot from today's session, and I should allow others to ask their questions and listen to Adrian with his interesting heart. So thanks very much, Bob. And once again, just a little commercial for the Congenital Heart Academy, that if you look at this, you can go and look at this session again and again so that you can understand this with Bob's commentary about the development of the ventricular septum. And thank you very much, Bob.
Well, thank you, Norman. Thank you for getting up so early. You could have had an extra hour's sleep today.
Yes, well, but it wasn't worth the risk of missing you, Bob.
So, who wants to come in next? Diane, do you have any comments?
Diane, please.
Oh, who is this? This is Salvador Dali, isn't it?
Exactly. And I think this is what you mean by the expansion of the primary ring, because
Yeah,
I'm trying to...
absolutely. I mean, you're showing us there how we've got the orifice of the tricuspid valve with that lovely
Exactly.
clock that is bent over the corner of the table.
Exactly. So the
Perfect.
primary ring is here initially, but then when it expands in its dorsal part, so it's not perfectly right, but the melting clocks of Dali, I think they show how that primary ring goes around the tricuspid orifice that would be here, isn't that?
That is absolutely correct. That's a very nice analogy. That's a very pretty picture that you show us there. And in fact, the whole thing about the primary ring, it remains a Mobius strip.
Yes.
So even after the secondary foramen has expanded and after the aortic root, that then moves what you show us that secondary part, because that then moves again into the left ventricle and you end up almost with a figure of 8. And Dali has not drawn us the figure of 8.
Exactly. So, but I think he would have made a good cardiac morphologist.
Okay. Well, but the difference between Dali, Adrian, and Bob's work is that, number one, Dali did it upside down compared to the way we look at it. And he didn't really understand that it's a temporal phenomenon.
Yes, yes, indeed. Now, Prof, I just wanted to ask you a quick question. You mentioned for the outlet, the boundary as being the sinotubular junction.
Indeed.
Okay.
And this is something that I introduced you to. I didn't really explain it very well, but that also has only become evident to me. Well, I mean, you and I have been having extensive discussions over the remodeling and of the formation of the arterial root. But when we think about it, when you think of the arterial root, you have these extensions of the outflow tract of the cavity of both the right and the left ventricle, and they reach up to the sinutubular junction, because essentially the roots have become part of the ventricles. So the cavities through these extensions reach to the sinutubular junction, and the myocardium is only found at the base of the sinuses. And we'll discuss this, as I said, the next time when we talk about development of the outflow tract. And this has been a major change for me, because I've always thought that the ventricle ended at the myocardial arterial junction, but that's not true, because in fact, the cavity does go all the way up to the sinutubular junction.
That's a very interesting point. That again, a quick clinical correspondence is what we call supravalvular stenosis.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay.
Because in fact, the supravalvular stenosis is still part of the valve.
We will discuss that on the last session. I just wanted to make sure I understood correctly.
No, you have picked up on that, Ab, and that is something again that the whole sequence of these sessions has made me, and I know you. I mean, you, as I say, you and I have been discussing these things at great length, and we're having to. I mean, you made a very good point in one of the comments you made to me today when you pointed out that we have the concepts, and the hardest part of all is explaining them so in such a way that everybody else can understand. And you and I have found that we don't always understand what we're saying to each other.
Anyway, Diane, please, sorry.
The only comment I would make, referencing what Norman brought up about the tubercles, is in my early fetal autopsy population, I see quite a number of what we call central perimembranous VSDs. And I often wonder, because I don't see a lot of them in the newborn presenting ages, if those eventually between, for instance, 12, 13 weeks and full term would eventually close. Because a lot of the majority of VSDs that I see in my early fetal population are those small central perimembranous VSDs, which is where you would expect those tubercles to close the defect.
Well, I bet that takes us on, in fact, to the mechanism of closure of all perimembranous defects, does it not, Norman? And probably many, I mean, Norman, in your fetal experience, how many cases do you see closing during fetal life?
A fairly substantial number, Bob. I mean, I think you find perimembranous VSDs that are there in early fetal life, and then as you go on, they disappear.
Indeed.
And that would tell us that the outflow cushions and the coalescing ventricular trabeculations were all normally formed, except for those tubercles closing that small defect.
Indeed, indeed.
So there's ongoing development and closure of ventricular septal defects in fetal life, not only of membranous defects, but also of muscular defects.
Absolutely.
And we've certainly been able to document a number of these.
Yeah, I agree, Norman, because there are some that I can't even identify in the fetus from the right ventricle, but as soon as I open the left, I see those nice little tiny punched out lesions that I could see how they would close very readily during continued gestation.
Indeed, I've seen a number of very large muscular ventricular septal defects that continue to close after birth. I mean, I don't think that birth in the course of cardiac development from fetus to adults has a very special relationship to the birth process itself. It's an ongoing spectrum throughout development.
Adrian, you want to discuss one of the pictures that
Just a quick question on the fact that the roots, I don't know whether it's related to the spiraling process that you discussed, but the way that they end up in an orthogonal position, is that when you think they start together, yes?
No, that is not true. No, they start from that orthogonal position. That is something else that I will discuss next time.
Okay.
When the aortopulmonary septum fuses with the distal end of the major cushions, that puts the arterial roots into their definitive position. So that is why it is probably the fusion of the aortopulmonary septum with the major septum. Exactly, yes. That is what gives you the crossing point. It's the way that the aortopulmonary septum grows in and fuses with the distal end of the major outflow cushions. We'll discuss that next time.
Okay, perfect.
So I see, Bob, the interesting issue here is how we've all developed over the course of studying embryology concepts that are difficult to release, that are related to theory rather than practice.
Oh,
And
without
that's
question. I mean, to me, the most important thing has been the availability of these interactive PD files. And you pressed me to say whether they are. You've now gained access to those files, have you not?
Yes.
And you've been able to play with them, and you've been able to do things, and you can. I mean, it is amazing when you get the files and you download them, and you see. You can actually see what is happening, and you can see how the different components change relative to each other.
Yes, right. And I think that Tim Mohan's stuff is absolutely phenomenal. I mean, that unfortunately is not released for general.
That is correct. He did have a website, but you're right, that website is no longer available. But Adrian has also made the point that he would very much like to gain access to this material. And I'm hoping to meet with Tim Mohan and to resurrect it. Whether we'll ever get it again to make it widely available is another matter. But we certainly have to preserve it because those data sets are quite amazing.
Absolutely. I mean, it's so clear, and I'm sure that there's other information. I don't know how many hearts he has that he's done that episcopic microscopy, but there must be because it's mouse hearts.
The mouse heart, we have at least 500. I have 500 data sets on my computer. The human, not quite as many. We only have about 20 or 30 human data sets.
Yeah. But anyway, now almost everybody has got three-dimensional access to slicing and dicing.
Absolutely.
And that's very, very useful.
I think Adrian wants to show us something, right, Adrian?
Yes, it was just a heart that we were trying to discuss and show, and I'll just show this briefly, but I'll take pictures later on. So this is the right ventricular mass, the right ventricle way inlet to outlet. But I wanted to show here the pulmonary trunk, as you see, with the pulmonary valve leaflets. There is a ventricular septal defect.
I think you've stopped moving.
It's frozen your image, Adrian.
Oh, how is it now?
Green again.
Still. Now
we can see it.
Okay. What I'd like to show here is that we have an outlet ventricular septal defect. You can see the valve, the aortic valve here. This is the pulmonary valve here. You see that the posterior inferior border is muscular. Yeah, I hope that is very clear, that you can't get more muscular than this.
You are right. This is Adrian is showing us this because we are looking for a defect that has a juxta-arterial defect, which this for sure is. Adrian is now showing us the fibrous outlet septum.
Exactly.
And the fibrous outlet septum is deviated in anterocephalad fashion.
It is here, you can see, and I'll show it from the left ventricle, because in the left ventricle, you can show how the aorta is overriding easily. This is the aorta with aortic leaflets, how it's overriding the defect. And also you can see here the remnant that we can see from the other side, from the right side.
That's an
So-
exquisite heart, Adrian. That is exactly what we are looking at.
Exactly, and it has a posterior-inferior muscular border.
It does indeed. And the reason that we're looking this, if we still have our attendees watching, is that we're trying to produce an atlas of the phenotypes of the congenitally malformed heart. And this was a phenotype, a juxta-arterial defect with anterocephalad deviation of a fibrous outlet septum with a muscular posterior inferior rim.
Yeah.
I mean, do you think it is tetralogy, Adrian, or is it the Eisenmenger
I think-
effect?
Well, if I close the heart here, you can see it becomes quite narrow. I think the deviation is quite significant. You see,
Yes,
if I close,
yes.
you see how significant and it restricts the outflow towards the pulmonary valve here.
And if you open it again, I think there's a septoparietal trabeculation also. Very
Yes.
nicely that you see there.
Yes.
Beautiful.
So I think
Had the outlet septum been more extensive and muscularized, then for sure that would have been tetralogy of Fallot.
yeah. So I think it's quite a nice heart.
It's a beautiful heart.
for what we
Absolutely
need.
beautiful.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for sharing that with us.
Thank
So
you.
we can all stop looking now.
We can all stop looking now. That is
Is-
correct. That's the first one I've ever seen of that particular phenotype. So Adrian, thank you so much.
Eisenmenger? Is it an Eisenmenger type of defect?
No, I think Adrian is correct. It's a tetralogy.
I think it's a tetralogy. I'll get the postmortem as well, because that will explain a bit of the clinical features of the patient. But I think it's a tetralogy. It's been definitely, when we looked at it, Prof, we consider it tetralogy.
And it's the so-called Mexican tet that the late Aldo Castaneda. Aldo called it the Mexican tet. It's also called the Oriental tet. And that is exactly the specimen we're looking for, Adrian. So
I would argue not to use that terminology anymore. Otherwise, it can get into troubled waters.
indeed, you're right. We have to be very difficult with political correctness these days. You are correct.
The question is, if a tetralogy is defined by the anterior and superior cephalad displacement of the outlet septum, and there's no outlet septum.
Well,
Is
there's
that-
a fibrous outlet septum.
Oh, there's a fibrous out.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
Let's-
so it is the squeeze between the fibrous outlet septum and the septoparietal trabeculations.
Yes.
So
That
that
makes-
fits the phenotype.
Yeah.
So
I
there
bet
is-
you a number of tetralogies have been thus called.
you see this fibrous septum that is here, this is just under the leaflets. The leaflets stop here, and this is the remnant of the outlet septum. Yeah.
Yeah.
You see it here, and this is what is deviated anterocephalad in this heart. Is that little remnant of the outlet septum that is here? Yeah.
That's also a beautiful example of a ventricular septal defect cradled in the arms of the septomarginal trabeculation.
Oh,
isn't it?
yes. Yes.
Absolutely. And also the other thing you can see, Adrian, as we now look at it, is the pulmonary trunk is of smaller dimensions than the aorta.
Oh yes, yeah. That's why I think it makes it closer to a tetralogy, because if I close the heart, and I'll take pictures in all the features to show it clearly with the open heart and closed heart, and from the left and from the right.
It's beautiful. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
So Grace, I think we have only one question. And
Yeah.
the anonymous attendee wants to ask, is there a good book for different specimens and congenital malformations that can help a young fellow in the process of recognizing anatomical varieties? And indeed there is. It's called Wilcox's Textbook of Cardiac Anatomy. We are currently working on a 5th edition, and the 5th edition we are going to include a chapter on embryology, but you will have to be a little bit patient because it has not yet appeared.
And Bob, it's surgical.
The surgical anatomy, yes, but it provides the catalog that the young man is looking for. And of course, in the International Nomenclature Society, Marie Bailon is coordinating an effort where we're going to provide pictures for all the different phenotypes, and that the beginning of that will be available at the World Congress that Grace told us about initially.
And I think that they can also look at the app that we have provided, which
Of
has
course.
morphological correlations.
Okay, I should have mentioned that also, Norman. Why don't you advertise your app? Tell them all about your app. We've
Well,
still
it's
got,
an
we've
app
still
that
got
we've put
42
together.
participants with us.
Yeah, we put together this app that describes echocardiographic and pathological correlations. And I think it gives you some help, particularly as I was thinking about it with the membranous flap, which so we have some beautiful pictures of membranous flaps in this. And you can almost see from its position that it was part of those tubercles.
There's not been a lot of advertising of the app, Norman.
It's being advertised now, Bob, as we speak.
And where will people find out about the app?
Well, it's going to be circularized generally onto a number of different sites.
But it is already available. It's been available, hasn't it?
It is available, yes, sure, through www.md1world.com, but it's going to be much more widely circularized.
There you are. Grace has put it up already. She's
There we go, Grace.
question. Thank you, Grace. That's wonderful.
Thank you, Grace.
Fan of this publication. I use it a lot. I have all the chapters.
And so you can
Thank you,
recommend
Grace.
it, can you?
Yeah, surely. And for fellows, I think this is very useful, especially if you're interested in echo. And if you want something more simple, easy to understand, but comprehensive at the same time, your book that Bill edited, it's amazing. So the Anderson textbook is really good. We
Absolutely.
we have beautiful pictures in a short, but it's straightforward, but comprehensive at the same time. It's very helpful.
So what you're saying, Grace, that's the YouTube archive.
And we have this as well. Everything that we have done from Congenital Heart Academy is available for free on YouTube in a simple way to understand. This is beautiful.
Grace, I just want to add one quick thing about the book, that if you buy the whole book now, you get a 25% discount. The whole book, which is 16 chapters, is now available for $100 for the entire volume.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
There is also a mention about the courses that are run, the clinical morphological courses that are run in Europe, in the UK. Definitely, there are 3 courses where participants can see the hearts, can manipulate them, so it will give more insight. Also, the World Congress, there will be a specimen-based section where, again, the participants can look at the hearts.
Okay. Well, so our final session on development will remind me of the date, Grace. It's April the...
I think it's 21st, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, 24th.
24th of April.
Yeah.
Yes. You
Okay.
said next week, Bob, in your description. You really meant next month.
Yes, I did mean next month. You are correct.
Just for those who are listening, if they go back and listen, it's next month, not next week.
Indeed, indeed.
I can hardly wait.
Okay.
So the 24th of April is a Monday.
21st.
21st of
The
April.
21st, okay.
Yes. Yes, because we're all due in, on the 24th, we're all due in Dublin for the Association of European Pediatric Cardiology. So the 21st of April. Thank you, Diane.
Thank you, everybody.
And
Thank
thank
you.
you.
Awesome.
Bye. Thank
Bye.
you.